Welcome, everyone. I hope you enjoy the first lecture and conversation. I'm an analyst with the Jungian Psychoanalytic Association, and this day is an experiment for us. Twice a year, we have training weekends, which are community colloquia, where the community of analysts and candidates gather generally upstate to train. And so this weekend, we decided to try an experiment where we're hosting a public event, and so it's a combination public event and also training weekend. And our hope is that those of you that are members of the public, the JPA analysts and candidates that are here, will all get to know each other and share ideas. So welcome, everybody. Okay. And it's my honor to introduce John Beebe. And John trained as a Jungian analyst at the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco, graduating in 1978. In 1979, he founded the San Francisco Jung Institute Library Journal, a quarterly now published by Routledge as Jung Journal Culture and Psyche in 1990. He became the first American co-editor of the Journal of Analytical Psychology, and between 2000 and 2002 served as president of the San Francisco Jung Institute. Over the years, he has been chair of the San Francisco Institute's Certifying International Student and Development Committees. Since 2010, he has been quite involved in the training of future analysts in mainland China, serving as a liaison to the Shanghai Developing Group of the International Association for Analytical Psychology, visiting analyst to the Guangzhou Developing Group, and a professor at the City University of Macau. His work on psychological types was recognized by the Association for Psychological Type International in 2009 with the President's Award for Merit. In addition to serving as co-editor with Ernst Fallseder on the C.G. Jung Hans Schmidt Gizan correspondence, he is the author of Integrity in Depth and a number of essays linking the growth of integrity to the development of one's psychological type. His own long-awaited book on typology, Energies and Patterns in Psychological Type, The Reservoir of Consciousness, will be published by Routledge in 2016. John? Thank you.
Chapter 10 of the book, Psychological Types, presents us with an 8-function attitude model of consciousness. Some of the insights by which Jung got there between 1904, when he first broached the type problem, and 1919, when he wrote the book Psychological Types, are dramatized, if only by our recognition of how much they were needed, in the Jung-Schmidt-Gizan correspondence that Ernst Fallseder and I prepared for publication in English. The insights came to Jung only slowly, but they are key moments in the development of the 8-function model. And for that reason, I'd like to quickly highlight 3 of them right here. First was the need to break free from the oversimplification that was undermining the credibility of Jung's insistence on the centrality and power of one's dominant consciousness to structure one's relation to truth. At the time of the correspondence, Jung still thought that all consciousness was rational, and that everything in the unconscious was irrational. The idea of the irrational was something he had taken from Bergson. Brilliantly, Jung had recognized that there were 2 basic types of rationality: Thinking, which Jung saw at that early time as the introverted kind of rationality, and feeling, which he imagined as the extroverted kind of rationality. I have to say, it was a big step to make feeling a rational function when Jung did, a big step. So, in the book, Schmidt-Gieson was cast as the extroverted feeling type in the dialogue, and Jung was cast as the introverted thinking type. What emerged, however, was a different clash altogether. Today, we would call it the clash between an introverted intuitive temperament, Jung's, arguing its position in extroverted thinking terms, and an extroverted intuitive temperament, Schmidt-Gieson's, arguing its position in introverted feeling terms. That Schmidt-Gieson and Jung could not agree about first principles is an understatement. Of the two, it was Schmidt-Gieson who realized that Jung's original two-function model needed to be expanded. He even provided, in his letter number 4, the first diagram of a four-function model. I invite you to look at footnote number 100, which I wrote in a very effusive way, and Ernst edited back down to a very dry, pointing out that this is not unlike what Jung gave us a few years later. The second insight follows. But it was Jung who engaged with Schmidt-Gieson's extroverted intuition in a real enough extroverted sensate way. He did it first by shaking up his own relation to truth through the Red Book experiences. The way he did this was by knowing he had lost his soul, that she would be a she, and that he had to find her and submit himself to her. That much he knew before he began. That his soul, however, presented herself as the embarrassing Salome who had demanded the head of John the Baptist, offered Jung a chance to put his original idea that all consciousness is rational on the chopping block. This was the payoff in his recognition that our area of incapacity is as important and valuable as our capacity where the development of consciousness is concerned. In the encounter with Salome, Jung's introverted intuition, which Ernst has demonstrated to be Jung's dominant function, subordinated itself to his inferior function, extroverted sensation, and allowed actually experiencing rather than just knowing to take the lead in his relation to the psyche. Extroverted sensation, the gritty, textured, keenly observant consciousness that informed Jung's active imagination, was personified by a woman he had always looked on as his inferior, the infamous belly dancer Salome, who had kissed the head of John the Baptist when it was brought to her still dripping blood. Jung submitted his knowing to his experiencing and let Salome show him what was in the irrational realm, the reality of the psyche and the gifts of prophecy and magic. In this way, he first experienced and then knew that consciousness is more than thinking and feeling. It is also sensation and intuition. A third great moment of insight comes, also in the Red Book, when Jung, through the adventures that Salome arranges for him, experiences the types of consciousness that were in shadow for him, in figures such as the tricksterish red one, the crazy, intrusive Anabaptists, the dry anchorite, and the lazy tramp. These experiences, I think, help to clarify that the conflict between Schmidt-Gizan and Jung was not just between extrovert and introvert, or between feeling and thinking, but also, and more fundamentally, between two very different kinds of feeling, two very different kinds of thinking, and above all, two very different kinds of intuition, leaving the two men understandably at loggerheads as to how the type theory should develop. Thus, in time, Jung came up with what we would now describe as his 8-function attitude model of consciousness as the best way to describe the categories of consciousness that come into conflict between people. At this point, Jung is clear that the dominant function is not our only available type of consciousness, but rather one of many. At the time Jung was untangling his model, Beatrice Hinkle here in New York came up with her own slightly different scheme, and Jay Sherry has been working on Hinkle's biography. I think her work on type definitely deserves a close look. And after Jung's publication, Catherine Briggs and her daughter Isabel Myers used Jung's work as the basis of the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the MBTI that is today the way most people understand typology. Myers and Briggs followers in hundreds of publications have made major contributions to describing the day-to-day experience of people as shaped by their inborn typological preferences. The main development in Jungian analytic thought about type during the same period has been von Franz's demonstration of how the inferior function establishes itself as the connecting point to the unconscious. Following von Franz's lead, my own work has been to see Jung's typology not as his ego psychology, as many would have it, but as his self-psychology, remembering that the English edition of Psychological Types is subtitled The Psychology of Individuation. So today, I would like to take insight in a somewhat new direction. By individuating the types of consciousness we all carry and asking what they look like in all of us as they develop from persona to ego to self. The third, most developed level, the self level, I might also call the jouissance, the playful joy of the function, when we use it most fully as a consciousness that not only defends and asserts ourselves, but actually connects us in a rather deep way to the reality of others whom we can allow to be different. So you can say, here endeth the lesson. Now I'm going to have you look at the handout that I gave you, so that each of you can kind of follow along as I unpack the 8-function attitudes that Jung names in psychological types. So to get us used to the language code, we of course have the 4 functions and the 2 attitudes. And so I'm going to be referring to feeling with a capital F and thinking with a capital T, and intuition with a capital N, not to confuse it with introversion, and S with sensation. This is done by type practitioners all over the world, so it's hardly original. The attitudes, E for extroverted, I for introverted. So you see on the handout a list vertically, starting with extroverted sensation in the top left, going down to introverted feeling, the bottom left, on the left-hand column, the 8 function attitudes that Jung names in the names that have become so familiar to us, who read Jungian psychology, and at the same time, so incredibly opaque that very few people that I have ever met in my life can truly tell one from another. It would be almost as if we're trying to work with music and no one has ever taken a solfège class, and they can't tell the difference between do and re and mi and fa. And if we can't do that with the psychological types, we've completely lost what Jung intended with his lexicon, which was to actually give us a way to read human consciousness. So I talked about this problem over and over again with a number of people, and one of them was the novelist Diane Johnson, who's a good friend of mine. Some of you may know her novel, Le Divorce. A few of you may know her novel, The Shadow Knows. She's a quite wonderful writer, a very psychologically minded writer, and like me, a lover of Henry James and Jane Austen. And she said, you know, we really have to find words in common speech that correspond to the function attitudes that Jung is talking about, because these names that Jung has given them may have worked for him and they may have become a kind of lingua franca in the Jungian world, but nobody's getting it. I'm not seeing what they're talking about. So with that inspiration, for the last several years, I've been looking for the names that actually seem to me to fit the 8 functions. And some of you in the room were present when I was at a conference in Cleveland, where I actually gave my first effort to come up with 8 names that I thought got to the heart of the different functions of consciousness. So quickly, and stating very quickly what those names were on that particular day. I came up with for extroverted sensation with experiencing. And I came up for introverted sensation with verifying. I came up with, for extroverted intuition, with envisioning. And I came up for introverted intuition with knowing. And for extroverted thinking with planning. And for introverted thinking with defining. For extroverted feeling with affirming. And introverted feeling, this was the hard one. Eventually I came up with appraising. Now, those words seemed to me to describe in gerund language, verbal nouns, what these mental processes were actually trying to accomplish for the people who were using them, their method of being conscious, their particular favored method of being conscious. And I was watching like a hawk the people in the room as I was talking, and as the names emerged, it seemed to make sense to the people there. It happened, I have to say, rather fast. It tumbled out rather quickly, and I think the unconscious had quite a role in what happened that day. Now, in that particular room, there was a man named Dick Custer who began to think that one word was not enough. That if you could create a semantic field and you could in some way get other words that I had mentioned en route, that they were words that were close to what I was talking about, but not the heart of what I was talking about. So he took things that I'd already said, and he made a little diagram that he handed to me at the break. And he remembered that I had used the word defining for introverted thinking. So he was interested in that. But he said along the way, I had tried out naming, and I had also tried out understanding. So he did a little diagram, a little triangle, with defining at the apex and naming and understanding at the lower corners. And suddenly, there was a semantic field that if you looked at it, suddenly what introverted thinking is about seemed, at least to me, to come alive. So in a moment of heady inspiration, in front of a very loving and patient group of people who were there for 4 days to hear me talk about psychological type, and we had the luxury of going on about it, and lots of people who were type practitioners and had used type for years, I proceeded, and as fast as I'm talking to you right now, because some of you who are there will remember it, to create triangles for all 8 function attitudes. And something happened to us. It was as if, at that point, it began to be clear what we'd always been talking about, and we could begin to see what each of us who were bent on using particular functions of consciousness were actually doing or thought we were doing when we were doing that. So that became the diagram that you now have, which has on its one sheet of paper 24 names, 24 words for the 8 function attitudes. Now, it took me quite a while of working with what had emerged to realize that I had what looked to me like a temporal sequence. If you read across from, now this is me and Jung, the left to the right. I was 20 years old before I knew my right from my left, I want you all to know. The function we call introverted thinking starts with naming something. In fact, you can often spot an introverted thinking type by the particular precision with which they insist on using words. It can drive some people crazy. It can be very refreshing to others. Naming, it's where it starts. By the way, hidden in the background is the word identifying, which I rejected only because it has so many other meanings in psychology. But that naming is a form of identifying. But introverted thinkings don't just identify something, they name it. They always name it. They have to name it. But what it's moving toward is something much more subtle than naming. It's actually defining a situation, defining what we're talking about. The great James Hellman, who I'm sure was using introverted thinking as his leading function, was astonishingly good at defining what we're talking about. His essay on the feeling function is an exercise in defining, which is just jaw-dropping. Now, this defining is, of course, not taking dictionary definitions and repeating them. It's freshly and originally defining by consulting some kind of internal place that already knows whether the definition fits or not. That's the introverted move. There's some kind of archetypal process that the introverted functions use as their background against which to come up with what they do. So the defining, if you've ever heard a James Hillman lecture or read a James Hillman essay, you can see and find that process in action. There's some kind of standard of truth that is constantly being used against which the words come, and that's very exciting. Of course, sometimes does not know when to stop, and that's the other side of that. But it's not just caught up in defining. It's moving towards something else in time. It's hoping to get to understanding, really understanding, which is beyond naming or defining or to understanding. So that by the time you get to understanding, you are with Lao Tzu when he says, the name that can be named is not the true name. And by the time you're through with Lao Tzu, you do understand what the Tao is in a very wonderful way. And that movement is very much a movement there. So at first I thought, well, this is just how the function develops over time, how it ripens, how it likes to work in a conversation with a friend, how it likes to present itself. But gradually I realized that these three moments are not just time sequence moments along some path by which the function ripens and comes into its own. They also belong to very different worlds of what I could call self-development. And those words have already been given perfectly good names by C.G. Jung. And those names are persona, ego, and self. So at the persona level, introverted thinking can be a little bit obnoxious because it's always naming everything with a vocabulary just a little ahead of everybody else's, even if the words are short. One is more grateful to it when it defines, if it doesn't go on too long. And there's a lovely thing to watch an intellectual, introverted thinking type defining a situation. It's fun. But that's the ego level. The self level is something very, very different. The self level is a moment where not only has a deep connection been made by the person to the telos, to the goal of the whole mental process, the whole function, but there's an unus mundus to it. There's a connection with others to it. Suddenly, as it's been not just named and defined, but everyone begins to understand together, something really exciting happens. And that is led by the introverted thinking, but it certainly transcends the ego, and it's certainly no longer just a persona. It's a deeply connected self level of the function. And this is what I'm calling the jouissance of the function. It's a great pleasure. Listening to James Hillman lecture could be like listening to the greatest jazz. It was wonderful to hear him blow. It was just absolutely wonderful, and it was thrilling, and it made you feel better until the last 10 minutes when he went on past the point he should have stopped. But each of the functions has that particular built-in liability that even at the self level, sometimes it goes on a little too long. I speak this way of Jim in full projection, because when I was using my introverted thinking, which is my auxiliary function, I remember once when I was applying to the college literary magazine, and I kept trying to add one more brilliant insight onto another, someone said, you know, having killed Hector, it's really not seemly to drag his body around in the sand. So no function can do everything. So one of the questions in individuation is, why aren't we always just in the ego of the function? What is the persona of the function, and what is the self of the function? Well, one thing I've learned in my type work is that when you're using one of the functions of consciousness at the persona level, you're defending yourself to some degree. And there's just a little bit of an oppositional attitude in the way in which you're using the function. So often, when introverted thinking people, you meet them for the first time, and the first thing you notice is that naming persona, you're also noticing that they've got just a smidgen of extroverted thinking in there. They're defending themselves with the same function with the opposite attitude. It's just somehow in there, so that somehow the thinking, although very precise, you have the funny feeling you're being pushed away, you're being managed, you're being handled in some way. It could be that you're being seduced, it could be that you're being avoided, it could be that someone is being a bit passive-aggressive at your expense, or they may even be using the function in a frankly rather paranoid way. In any case, there's just a touch of the opposite attitude, so that it becomes introverted thinking with just a bit of extroverted thinking thrown in, and there usually is that feeling of, ooh, that person doesn't want to get close to me. Now, I believe that when we use any function in that persona way, we're slightly obnoxious. People actually are a bit annoyed by us. And so when we meet each other, and the persona of the typology, that the type of consciousness we habitually use, might be our dominant function, might be some other, but the one we're using is being used, if used in a persona way, also in a somewhat defensive way. And I think it immediately attracts type prejudice. It's as if the one thing we can't stand about that person is their psychological type. We don't say it in Jungian terms, but that's what it is. We don't like that type. And for many people, that's where typology and studies of typology end. They only see the persona use of the function, and it makes them a little angry. If we are privileged, as I am privileged, to sit across from people for long periods of time, many hours, 5 days a week, of individual people in psychotherapy telling me how it is for them, I have the luxury of hearing what people are actually like when they are being at least the ego they want to be, if I've created the space where they can at least do that. Then I get a very, very different picture of the type. So the person who may have annoyed me initially by his need to name everything in sight begins to thrill me by their ability to define. And suddenly I'm really interested in the definitions they come up with, and I'm enchanted by it. And the ego of the person is now something that's welcome in the consulting room and unfolds. And then that work that I think is the work of almost every psychotherapist I know, of some kind of ego building, some kind of ability to let the ego of the person be and come forward, it's really quite exciting to see the different types of consciousness and to see why God made them all, why they all have a right to be, whatever your original type prejudice. And you can begin to see what Jung was trying to do with his theory, which was to give the working psychotherapist some way to feel the beauty of consciousness. However, if you do long-term psychotherapy work, sooner or later, you get sick and tired of someone's ego in exactly the way that you were once annoyed by their persona. There's a way in which you feel like if all we're going to get is that ego over and over again, I don't know if I can stand to keep on doing this work. Maybe we're fortunate, I'm getting older, I could retire, and so forth and so on. And that is the time when the miracle either happens or it doesn't happen, where the person themselves, either picking up a little on your impatience, which I think is sometimes a very therapeutic ingredient, or sometimes just because having come this far, why not go all the way, the person begins to open up to the self level of the function. Now, I have noticed that when that happens, whatever function it may be and wherever it may be located in our typology, it only works if the inverse of that function, that which, if we were talking about the dominant function, would be its inferior function, also gets into the mix. In fact, it may happen first that that comes up a little before that self level is reached. So I want to show you this slide to remind you of something that Jung discovered, which I think is amazing. And if this isn't science, it'll have to do until the real thing comes along, because I've actually seen it. I think it's there. Or have I been taken in by the theory? I don't think I know. But to me right now, there's a great truth in the idea that the functions exist in relation to their inverse. And we sometimes use the term opposite confusingly, and Jung often used, that's one of the terms like truth that he could use confusingly or blurringly. But introverted intuition and extroverted sensation are in reciprocal or inverse relation to each other. Extroverted intuition and introverted sensation, extroverted feeling and introverted thinking, and introverted feeling and extroverted thinking all form axes of consciousness. Those 4 axes should be learned by heart in the first grade, but of course we're not there yet. Very, very important. Now, if we were to go back to our introverted thinking, before introverted thinking is going to get to the point that it creates understanding at the self level, the person is going to have had to make some kind of gesture in the direction of extroverted feeling. So now I want to show you the extroverted feeling. Extroverted feeling is very much the inverse of introverted thinking. It's a completely different set of strategies. At the persona level, it's totally validating. There is, I'm okay, you're okay. No matter what anyone says, that's great. That's great. Extroverted feeling. It's not as political and as cynical as it sometimes seems to people who don't like extroverted feeling when they meet it as a persona. At its heart, it's really about affirming the right of others to be and the being of others, and it's a very exciting function. It's one of the few functions that really works to deal with extremely wounded and particularly psychotic people. Our best treatment for psychotic people is not phenothiazine, it's appropriate extroverted feeling. It's an amazing, as Harry Stack Sullivan and many others knew, very, very important. And Jung was able to deploy that extraordinarily well with psychotic patients, something that most people don't realize about him, but he did. But again, it moves toward relating. So that trajectory of extroverted feeling has to be glimpsed and experienced in some way as important to someone using introverted thinking if they're ever going to use introverted thinking at the self level of understanding. So look at that inverse trajectory and then go back to the slide about introverted thinking and see how you get from defining to understanding by taking a little bit of a dip through validating, affirming, and relating. And then you begin to kind of get the magic and the mystery of these 8 function attitudes. Each of them implies an individuation trajectory, one which involves disconnecting with the opposite attitude use of that function to keep others at a distance, and the other connecting to what might be called the anima inverse of that function that enables it to somehow become connected to other people at the level of the self. And then think about where we mostly are and have to be, which is neither at the level of the defended persona or the unus mundus connected self, but functioning as an ego, and then see how different our projects are as people who are in the business of making themselves effective in the way they deploy their consciousness, how amazingly different we are. If we just go back to those 8 terms that I started with, imagine someone whose greatest interest is in defining, and someone else whose greatest interest is in verifying, and someone else whose greatest interest is in affirming, and someone else whose greatest interest is in planning, and someone else whose greatest interest is in knowing, and someone else whose greatest interest is in envisioning, and someone else whose greatest interest is in experiencing. What do we do with all these amazing differences between people? Now, Jung gave us a help when he said that some of these ways are rational ways and some are irrational ways. I mean, believe me, I don't choose to envision, I just envision as an extroverted intuitive. And I think many people don't. And many people choose to affirm because they're dealing with a rational function like extraverted feeling. So how can someone understand the ego of someone who chooses to affirm and wonders why I don't make that choice when I just envision and wonder why that's not happening to them? The difference between us is probably greater than the difference between men and women, the difference between the rational and the irrational type. I find I have more in common with women who are also irrational than with men who are rational, because they're on a different journey. And I have to shake myself to realize they have a choice. I have no choice. My intuitions simply happen to me, and I have to follow them, and I have my whole life. But they're certainly not, but they've not been choices. I hope this little glimpse gives you a sense of the reason that I have taken typology seriously since I first encountered it. I have to say, when I was 18 years old and made friends with a former patient of Beatrice Hinkle's, Nancy Hale, wonderful writer, wonderful Jungian writer. And Nancy was using Hinkle's system, which involved complicated terms like emotional introvert and subjective extrovert. And I remember asking her when I was 18 whether I was an extrovert or an introvert. And she said, "Oh, there's no question you're an extrovert. You're just a very introverted extrovert with lots of introspection." But that was good enough for me. That was my first type. That was my first type diagnosis. So I'd like to engage all of you. I've sort of told you sort of what matters to me about this, and why I'm doing this, and some of the words I've come up with. You have the sheet. I could explain every single word on the diagram to you, but I think it's more interesting to take the time we have to dialogue just a little bit with you, so that we can see the implications of how I'm seeing Jung's map of consciousness as also a map of potential individuation. That's what I'm seeing here. I'm trying to show you how the types themselves are pressing toward some kind of individuation of themselves. So I wanted to kind of let you engage with me a little, just to see what you do with this, what you do with this idea. Yeah. Beverly? Yeah.
It's rather stunning how often type is unconsciously used to pathologize the other. And I was thinking that last year when the DSM-5 was in the process of being formulated, introversion was put under a form of pathology. So that gives you some sense of even how on a cultural level there's a projection onto another type as if it's pathological, and I was wondering if you could address that.
Well, I actually did address it. We were called upon it. The ideas for the new nomenclature were presented sometime in February of, as I recall, 2010. And I was on the phone the very next day to 3 presidents of organizations. One was the president of the IAP, Hester Solomon. One was the president of APTI International, and one was the president of the Council on North American Society of Jungian Analysts, Dunbar Carpenter. Adam, tell me the name of the president of the APTI International. It was in San Francisco before. It doesn't matter at this moment, but if you remember, let me know, because you knew her and we talked. I called her. In any case, everyone agreed to help. And so I was participant in the construction of 2 of the letters. And letters were invited, actually, about the plans. And the plan was to create introversion as not exactly this time a personality disorder. That had been tried with DSM-3 in 1980, and Thomas Kirsch had done what I did in 2010 as the president of the Jung Institute of San Francisco, and wrote a letter to Robert Spitzer. And the letter that he wrote to Robert Spitzer basically strongly talked about how introversion was a normal process in human life. What I suggested that Hester say is that it's as stupid for a psychiatrist to pathologize introversion as it would be for a pulmonologist to be told to pathologize inspiration. And it seems that we were heard. Our colleague David Rosen knew a man named Les Morey at Texas A&M University, who was actually on the team making up the criteria for this particular section. He brought the concerns, And they say that they dialed it back to withdrawal as the thing they were calling introversion. But the prejudice is still there, and I think it's going to pop out again. It just comes back again and again. There's something wrong with people who are introverted. And I think that's been going on since the Enlightenment. And I think it's a shadow side of extroverted thinking planning that it would come out in the diagnostic nomenclature. Very off-putting. Yeah.
Thank you very much. On the matter of four-function model versus the eight-attitude function model,
Right.
in Isabel's book, Gift-Differing, somewhere in there is a pretty good rundown of the eight attitude functions.
Yes.
Now, given that, we should still alive, I asked Mary McCauley about that.
No.
Why it's not in the popularized Jung-Myers model, strictly four functions. And she indicated, somewhat defensively, the reason was is to keep it simple and don't complicate it too much for the public. Could you add to that?
Well, yes, I knew Mary McCauley too, and she was very fond of what I was doing with psychological types, and so was Catherine Myers, Catherine Myers, Isabel Briggs-Myers' daughter-in-law, who's very, very in favor of the eight-function approach. And they've all told me that the issue is that the MBTI is an indicator. It's not the way to type anyone. In fact, in the Association for Psychological Type International, it's considered unethical to type people on the basis of administering the MBTI. You have to, at the very least, have a follow-up individual one-on-one interview that begins with something like, you really can be any type you want to be. The indicator seems to indicate you are this pattern of dominant and auxiliary function, and let's see if it fits you. I'll tell you what the terms mean. You see if they fit you. Unfortunately, in the real world, I see Jungian analysts who feel that the only way they could possibly know their type is to take the MBTI, which is a complete misunderstanding. Even worse, there's online in China a watered-down version of the MBTI, and someone will take it online. I heard of a situation where a young woman got herself and her boyfriend to, her fiance, in fact, to take the MBTI, found out they were incompatible and broke up at once. So the misuse of this is a terrible, terrible problem. And the only cure for that is if we can ourselves learn to recognize the different consciousnesses. It's perfectly possible to figure out what consciousness a person is using if you train yourself, as I'm trying to help you recognize, that's why I came up with this, to help people have type recognition so that you can actually recognize extroverted sensation for what it is and tell it as different from introverted intuition and introverted thinking. But right now, we're stuck in a very primitive form of typology that we've got to find a way past if we're going to use this as I think Jung intended it be used. Yeah.
I'm looking over your words here, and I find it so interesting for the introverted intuition
Yeah.
that you ended up with knowing for the ego level.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded, since Ernst brought it up, that Jung says in that interview that he doesn't believe in God, that he knows.
Yes.
So I find that a kind of an interesting coincidence. But my question is that Jung defined intuition as perception via the unconscious. So how do you relate that to the persona and ego? Because it's kind of hard to see an unconscious function being used in those ways.
I'm going to endorse something that Ernst said, that Hillis Quispel also said there was a way in which Jung couldn't think. it's shocking in a man as brilliant as he was, because James Hellman said talking to Jung was like looking at the sun. I mean, there's no question that Jung was brilliant. But some of his thinking formulas are, in my opinion, very, very, leave a lot to be desired, and that's one of them. Now, there's a tremendous, wonderful new book by Natalie Pillard, Pilhard, which has just come out from Karnak Books that I recommend to all of you. It's called Jung and Intuition. And this is the book we have all been waiting for, in which all the different ways Jung uses the term intuition, all the different meanings it has, and the intellectual pedigree, all the way back to Kant's intellectual intuition and so forth. But I have to say that calling intuition perception by way of the unconscious smacks of his model of the mind in 1912 when he wrote the first version of Symbols of Transformation that Beatrice Hinkle translated into English as Psychology of the Unconscious, in German, Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido. And there he had the idea that there were two kinds of thinking, and the kinds of thinking that belonged to the conscious mind is the rational thinking, and the kind of mind thinking that belongs to the unconscious is the irrational thinking. So it took him a long time to accept that there was an intuitive function at all. It was Maria Moltzer, his associate for a time, who suggested the idea in a lecture she gave to the newly formed Analytical Psychology Club, and he himself says it took him over a year to accept it, and he never quite comes fully out of the closet once and for all and says, I am an introverted intuitive. But I know you, Vicky Jo, have found many examples where Jung says this, and Ernst has found what I think is the smoking gun, the way you translated that case that he talks about in the Houston interviews, and you just say that's really a self-description of Jung. I think you're absolutely right. If you've got going an idea from way back when, that the unconscious is where irrationality is, then by definition, for intuition to function as an irrational function, it has to go by way of the unconscious. But why not allow yourself to know what Jung learned only at the hands of Salome by experiencing it for himself, for once and for all? This is Jung's greatest discovery, but even he would slip away from it. There's such a thing as irrational consciousness. And irrational consciousness does not have to go via the unconscious. It works at the level of the conscious. And I don't think we're going to solve many of the problems in science, I think Beverly would say, in quantum theory and other places, if we cannot accept irrational consciousness. And I think Jung got it, but even he would go back to the way he used to think. And so I think that's what crept in there with that definition. So that's why I use these words instead of saying perception by way of the unconscious. I say that when I use extroverted intuition, I start by entertaining. And I entertain in two senses. I'm actually entertaining an idea, and I'm being entertaining while I entertain it, if I can be. And only gradually do I get to a point where I'm suddenly envisioning something. And once I've envisioned it, and if I'm willing to go down to my introverted sensation and actually go through a process, and it's a very painful process, of implementing and verifying and accounting, then I can actually enable what I've envisioned. And I have to say that I had to do this with the journal that I founded, where I had this vision that we could have a library journal in the Jung Institute that would really mean something. And it did become a very successful Jungian publication. But the only way it survived at my institute was making sure that we actually had a business model and we could actually account for the cost of the journal and the profit of the journal. And I got my introverted sensation friend Adam to help us with a careful look at the books, and I proved that we could make money on the journal, and we did for a number of years. And that enabled my vision to become something rather than one of the many non-starter intuitions that I'd seen all my life in the Jungian world. So that process of taking your function and taking it all the way has been very satisfying to me with a few projects. Otherwise, I would just wake up at night feeling that my life had really been a failure, that I'd had a lot of great ideas that never came to anything. And I didn't, for whatever reason, want that to happen to me. It was a value for me to keep going, and the types helped me figure out how you do that. So that would be my answer to that. Yeah, go ahead.
I was really interested in what you were saying about the persona
Yeah.
function. I wanted to just ask you a little bit more about what you were saying about the persona function, and you were isolating its role to defend. And I was wondering if you also thought that it had another role, which is to engage, and if so, how that would inflect what you were saying.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up because, and it's so to the point. The persona is either the most neglected of the Jungian archetypes or the most maligned, and I'm afraid I walked into the malignant side of it. What I was really trying to get at is how offensive the persona can be to others and how it can be a source of type bias. For the person who's wearing a persona, however, if anyone has ever tried to live without a persona, they find very quickly how miserable it is. And so what I do with a number of analytic people is help them build up the persona precisely, not only so they can defend themselves in the world, but so that they can actually connect with other people. And I certainly spend a vast amount of my energy developing a persona that I think will actually work with people, as I would have to do, and how I dress today, and how I clean myself up, and and how I figure out how I'm going to present this material in a way that would be halfway pleasing. All of that, I think, is terribly connective. So yes, there's a relatedness level to the persona. And even when you get to the self level, of course, the law of opposites is all through psychological types, there's a dark side to the self. So you can sometimes be at the self level and be quite in an evil place, not just in a place where your jouissance is everybody else's bliss, but actually it's very much at their expense. There's a sadism that can come up at that level, which is a very painful thing to contemplate, but anyone who's been around individuating Jungians long enough knows it's true. It's true. Yeah. Yes.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about rational and irrational aspects of the types, because, thank you, because, you were saying a little bit earlier how intuition is irrational. You can't account for it, it just comes to you. But I could say the same thing about feeling, I think. Maybe my understanding is a little primitive, but...
I think feeling is much closer in being something you can't control in that sense than thinking can be. You had much more choice in thinking in ways you're describing. And it was precisely for that reason that feeling was always placed in the irrational category by romantics and others. What I have noticed, though, is that introverted feeling often starts with a judgment that does not want to stay there, but wants to finish itself. So that it's true that when you first encounter something, you know, particularly if you have strong and introverted feeling, whether you like it or don't like it, and you immediately make a judgment. I think that phenomenon, I would agree. But what happens next and how the function develops seems to me to bring out the essential rationality of the function, because I've never worked with an introverted feeling type in analysis who, no matter how harsh the initial judgment was, didn't go on reflecting on it and appraise it and try to weigh it and bring it back to the next session and talk about it some more with me until what was initially something that almost made me want to terminate. I felt so rejected by I want to retaliate, in other words. The judgment on me is so strong, and I want to call it an unanalyzed superego pathology in them, but it's actually unanalyzed superego pathology in me that I take it so badly. And then but the person will come back, and if I can make a space, they will talk, and it will become an evaluation. It will become an appraisal, and it'll be very nuanced. And then we go beyond that to establish the value behind the whole thing, the judgment and the appraisal, so that I feel like I've had a course in moral philosophy by the time I'm through. And that feels to me, if you look at the process entirely over time, like a very rational process, in a way that my entertaining, envisioning, and enabling feels much less out of my control and just something that I just do. I mean, I don't work at it nearly as hard. I think the introverted feeling people work much harder in therapy than I did in that sense. And when I started working on my feeling, I'd say, oh my God, now I'm having to work as hard as they do. I used to enjoy going to therapy. Now it's really work to do that stuff. So I hope that helps you see why I keep them in two different places. Yes. Please, Ava. Yes. For time, we've got a little bit.
John, would you describe the difference between in extroverted intuition envisioning and in introverted intuition divining? Because if divining is at that self level, it almost feels as if we're working in the world of the unconscious, the oracular, the synchronistic. To divine almost has a deep intuitive function that's going into legends of. So anyway, if you could, that would be great, because the two sound very similar, but I know they're going very different directions.
Well, there are two names in the scheme that deliberately have double meanings, and one is entertaining for the extroverted intuition and the persona, because the extroverted intuitives are natural entertainers, but they're also people who naturally entertain new things. Now, divining does have a double meaning. In one sense, it's seeing in what direction the future is bending. I put a footnote on this just so that I would keep it straight myself. Seeing in what direction the future is bending. But it's also descrying the divine purpose in the developing situation, and I believe Jung did both. You see his divining in the statement he makes in I think it's the Zarathustra seminars, where he talks about the gods have become diseases. Jung seeing the God in the disease seems to me an act of divining. I also think that the genius of introverted intuition is to apprehend the divine. Sometimes the ability to apprehend the divine is so extraordinary that one thinks only God could know God that well. So I realize many people here are Christian, but in that image, God came to the earth as a man, and as a man, the man must have had, in addition to a human body, a psychological type, and I think that psychological type had to be introverted intuition. Now, if you're not quite Christian, as I say about myself, because I'm sort of Christian, but I'm not, in a certain way, in the sense that the divinity gets of the man bothers me, but I'm not sure I'm talking about a distinction with a difference, because the ability to divine God that well is very godlike. So that's one way to say it. There's a divinity in that kind of introverted intuition that the greatest religious geniuses have had. And they can feel what God is and tell us what it is. And if that isn't God, it'll have to do until the real thing comes along. It's like that for at least some of us. So that's the introvert, the strange. And Jung could do that. He could sometimes divine in that way. You could feel that. You could feel that.
Thank you, Jungs, for a wonderful talk. The nuance of it is amazing to me. So my question is, I think the better you get to know someone, the harder it is to say what type they are.
Yeah.
And could you relate that to the fact, which I find hopeful, that in the individuating journey, all types belong to each of us?
Yes, precisely. And you have found the God and the disease of my talk, because you are just right. Some of it is, of course, our connection to the inferior function, is our chance to encounter another that we care about deeply. And that's how it happened to me in my analysis. When I found my Anima and saw her alone in a room, not getting anything, and I felt something for her, and I began to take care of her, I had, for me, with an introverted sensation Anima, what Jung had with Salome as an extroverted sensation Anima. I had to love someone I never imagined I would care about at all. And once you have connected to that other, suddenly every other gets very interesting to you. And in that way, all the different consciousnesses that you carry become fascinating to you. So as you go along, you start having all these sidebar experiences, and I never heard it more clearly than when I went to visit Anila Yaffe, that Jung and people close to Jung had this very view of the types. I went to see Anila Yaffe, who had this extraordinary extraverted feeling auxiliary. And she was blind at that point. She was 90 years old, and I was terribly concerned with my inferior function being sensation about being late. So, of course, I arrived an hour early and was pacing outside first the street and then finally the apartment building. And finally, the Swiss superintendent of the building couldn't stand it any longer. He said, "Are you looking for someone?" And I said, "Well, yes, I have an appointment with Frau Yaffe at 11 o'clock, but please don't interrupt her." "Oh, no, she won't mind." And he buzzed me up 10 minutes early. And so I'm going to meet Anila Yaffe, horribly, horribly embarrassed. And so she comes in. She can't see me. I knew that. She was living alone. She was blind. And she feels my face, and she says, "Oh, very nice." And she says, would you like some tea or coffee? Coffee, tea. I have herbal tea. I have regular tea. And so I said, "I'll have some herbal tea." And so for this visitor from California, this blind 90-year-old woman went and found the tea bag with the herbal tea and brought it back to me. And as she put it back, she sort of put a couple of chocolate chip cookies on the saucer. And she said, "It isn't much." She said, "It's your punishment for being early." So, of course, we got close. And I asked her a bit about herself, and I asked her about her type. And she said, "Well, when I was younger, I was always introverted intuitive. But now I'm blind, and I have to feel my way around, so I'm a sensation type." And I think we could leave it there.